Last time we talked about the first half of photosynthesis being the so-called light reactions, and they're named that because they depend directly on light. And so now we need to start talking about the second half of the story of photosynthesis, which are called the dark reactions. And it's a bit of a misnomer in that the dark reactions don't require darkness in order to occur, but the point is that they do not require light directly. However, they do require some of the products of the light reactions themselves. This is the overall photosynthesis reaction that we've talked about before. Carbon dioxide plus water yields oxygen and sugars. Well, at the end of the light reactions, we have already accounted for the production of the 6 oxygen molecules, and we've also already accounted for the fact that water was split or chopped up, so to speak, during the light reactions. And so oxygen is a fortunate for us byproduct of the whole process, but the results of splitting of these water molecules are the two products NADPH, which is just an electron carrying type molecule, and ATP. And ATP, once again with the little explosion around it, is an energy carrying molecule, and these are the products of the light reactions. And you should also recall, hopefully, that they are produced and released into the stroma. So they're already floating around in the stroma, which is fortunate because that is where the dark reactions occur. And they do, in fact, run on NADPH, ATP, and carbon dioxide. And so this is where the carbon dioxide comes into the story. Now, if you're looking up at this equation here, the end product of all of this is to make sugars, and that is indeed the end product of the dark reactions. So let's talk in more detail about the dark reactions. The dark reactions take place in the stroma of chloroplasts. And just a quick reminder of what the chloroplast structure is like. The stroma is this region between the inner membrane and the thylakoid membranes. Remember, the gradient was created, ATP gets produced, is released out here in this stroma area, as well as the NADPH. So, in the stroma, floating around, are NADPH and also this ATP. But there are also lots of enzymes, and these dark reactions are enzyme-driven reactions. And enzymes, once again, are like little molecular machines that carry out chemical reactions. These enzymes as a whole are going to take CO2, NADPH, and ATP and use it to make glucose. The first enzyme of this process, and it's one of the largest enzymes known, and also because it's found in all plants, happens to be the most abundant enzyme on the face of the earth, and it is called rubisco. Now, like I was saying last time, ATP synthases and NADP reductases, these enzymes get named based on what they do. And rubisco is shorthand for ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase oxygenase, and so that's what the C and the O stand for. Rubisco's main job in photosynthesis is what's called carboxylation. And if you're following along in your notes, it states specifically what rubisco does, and rubisco basically combines CO2 with a molecule called ribulose bisphosphate, or RUBP for short. We can say to make a substance that is called 3-PGA. Okay, and that's in your notes already. This 3 is significant in that this denotes that this molecule here, which is the first real product of the dark reactions, actually contains 3 carbon molecules. And so this dark reactions that we're describing now in this particular version of it, which is the most widely found version in the plant world, this is referred to as the C3 cycle because of this 3-PGA molecule. So this is where it gets the name of the C3 cycle, okay, because of 3 carbons in this first product. And we'll often refer to this, and it's referred to in the heading of your notes, as the Calvin cycle or the C3 cycle. So that's the first product. So Rubisco, basically, if we were going to depict it or do a drawing of it, so to speak, we'd say this is a Rubisco enzyme. Okay, CO2 comes in, and this CO2 just comes from the atmosphere. It enters the leaves through the stomates, makes its way, diffuses through membranes, and makes its way into the chloroplast. And this CO2 binds with a Rubisco as well as this RUBP molecule, which binds with Rubisco. And the Rubisco basically spits out as a product the 3-PGA molecule. Now, again, this process is called carboxylation, and so this is the first major step of the dark reactions, and it's carboxylation. So that's pretty much the story of Rubisco, or the first part of these dark reactions. And the second main process here is referred to as reduction, and then there's a third process called regeneration. And all the steps of reduction and regeneration are enzyme and energy driven. Let me go ahead and write this along as if we're following in the notes, as you should hopefully be. Reduction and regeneration is enzyme driven. Okay. It is also energy driven. Where does the energy come from? Well, not light. Light is not required for this part of photosynthesis. These are called the dark reactions. The energy is provided by ATP, and NADPH provides electrons to these reactions. So energy comes from ATP, and electrons, remember E with a negative sign is an electron, come into this series of reactions from NADPH, both of which, as you recall, come from the light reactions. And so they enter a series of reactions that make up the rest of the steps of the dark reactions called reduction and regeneration. Basically, the end products of reduction and regeneration, we'll say, are a series of enzyme reactions produce a molecule called GAP, and they produce these molecules from the 3-PGA molecules already made by Rubisco, ATP, and NADPH. So this is another step product in this system. So the ATP and the NADPH that were made initially in the light reactions are getting consumed here in the dark reactions out in the stroma. The way this process proceeds, for every 3 CO2 molecules that Rubisco fixes, we get a total of 6 GAP molecules formed. Okay, and so out of these 6 GAP molecules, 5 GAP are used to recycle or remake, and this is the regeneration step, the RUBP stuff, so that Rubisco gets a steady supply of it. The one left over GAP molecule accumulates and is later made into sugar. So we'll say accumulates and is made into the C6H12O6 stuff, basically sugar. All right, so that is the C3 version of what are called the dark reactions. So let's look at a figure that kind of depicts this whole process here and get a better overview of the whole thing. And here we go. Again, this is in the stroma. This is a cycle because it's a continuous chain of reactions going on here. It all starts with Rubisco. Rubisco gets RUBP, combines it with CO2 to make 3-PGA. And again, we call this step carboxylation. And then the following steps, we have addition of ATP inputs. Also, NADPH donates electrons to form these GAP molecules, and these steps are called reduction. And from chemistry, this name means that these molecules, the 3-PGA, is getting reduced. They call it being reduced because as electrons are added, electrons being negative, they reduce the overall charge of the molecule. And so that's what this reduction term means technically. But, for our purposes, it's just these steps that produce the GAP from some additional ATP, NADPH, and they're just simply adding on bonds and adding on atoms to these PGA molecules. So some of the PGA accumulates, okay? So I'm going to write this as accumulation. And 2 or 3 steps later gets actually made into sugar molecules. The remaining GAP, 5 out of the 6, in this case we're following 6 carbon dioxide molecules. I don't want to get caught up in the numbers too much here. But these GAPs require a little bit more ATP to reproduce RUBP to keep the cycle turning. And these steps in here are referred to, again, as the regeneration steps. And so our inputs are carbon dioxide. ATP is another input. NADPH is an input. Output is sugar. There's another ATP input in this step of the process. And so inputs are in yellow, output is in orange here. The big molecule, the most important one of this process, is this Rubisco molecule. And again, it's called the C3 cycle because this stuff, 3-PGA, has 3 carbons in it. And so that's where this C3 nickname for this cycle comes from. This is also known as you can see in the notes, the Calvin cycle.